So we see that in Thailand, because it's a democratic society, we see that um, it provides more responsibility on the part of the rulers compared to junta regimes. So accordingly, the Ministry of Health had collaborated with other countries, universities, and NGOs to deal with the spread of HIV, and that's the institutional response to the spread of HIV. And and this also led to a openness of the topic to discuss openly how we can tackle this issue, and democracy has made those things possible so that people can discuss openly how to tackle the spread of HIV/AIDS. Now, if this is what Thailand's case in terms of cultural reasons for the spread and institutional explanation for the successful policy response, let's look at the case of Burma and Myanmar. You know, a little bit of history here. Burma is the um, name given by the Britishers. So Myanmar is the original name which was used. So people would feel offended, local people would feel offended if you call them Burma or Burmese. But um, at the same time, the name Myanmar is associated with the brutal history of junta, so they don't want to use Myanmar also because it would bring back that um, historical memory of a brutal regime. So I mean, it's little tricky by Burma, Myanmar. So having said this, let's look at the cultural reason for the spread of AIDS. So actually, the cultural reason in terms of Myanmar falls flat because can anybody tell me why? Because it's pretty much follows the same Buddhist cultural values as Thailand. So you cannot provide or compare cultural explanation for the spread because both the societies follow same cultural values. So it's difficult to, or it's not possible to compare a society which has same cultural values and provide a cultural explanation for the spread of HIV/AIDS. Um, on the other hand, the institutional explanation for the successful policy response or the lack of successful policy response can be looked at in the case of Myanmar. So, first thing, what's the uh, institutional explanation? What are the historical context? Um, Especially in the case of Myanmar, historical context matter because whereas Thailand was never under any colonial rule, even though it had exposure or contact with the West, but it was never colonized. Thailand was never colonized, whereas Burma was colonized by British, so it was under the British colony. So in that way, we see that you have that colonial baggage, and people are who fought against the anti-colonial forces, which fought against the colonial masters. You have that historical context to Myanmar's case. So accordingly, the colonized Burma, when it fought for freedom, when it became free, it immediately came under the junta regime, In this case, it's SLORC, which was brutal and corrupt. So that's one other way in the authoritarian regime you are answerable to only few, or in fact, you're answerable to none, and that led to the corrupt regime, and it was the situation in Myanmar, which can explain why the Myanmar society has to go through such lack of policy responses towards the spread of AIDS. The another important aspect which contributes to which the book talks about is the rampant heroin trade. It was one of the sources of revenue promoted by the authoritarian regime, but what happened was most of the heroin ended up staying in Burma, and then the next thing you see is people addicted to that, and then you see the spread of HIV/AIDS through needle usage. Another thing which is complementary of this or cause is injection equipment was made illegal by the military regime. So what happens when you propagate a policy which makes injection equipment illegal is that you tend to reuse because there is lack of supply of injection equipment. So these led to the spread of HIV/AIDS in Myanmar due to the policy followed by the junta regime, which banned the supply of injection equipment. Another cause was that since the authoritarian regime was not answerable to any particular group of people, or especially the stakeholders who are the citizens, there was no proper policy, especially in terms of health policy, to tackle the HIV/AIDS, and this led to a mess in the health sector without any proper policy, as compared to Thailand, where you had an efficient bureaucracy. In the case of Myanmar, the health sector was mess, and that also you know the historical context, we saw how it was against the West. So that West sentiment, they were not ready to allow for any Western institutions or Western groups to come and help. So you see all the equipments were of atrophy, in the sense they were from 1950s, where British colonial masters left the Burma. So it were using those old equipments still, and that there is no doctors being trained on the how to tackle the AIDS, because as we see, it was against the Western culture, Western attitude, and you have junta regimes, which was closed society, brutal, corrupt, not exposed to outside world. So next thing you see, you have doctors who are not exposed to the new research and new methods of treating AIDS patient. So that's also led to the spread of HIV. And then there is, as we saw in the other, as I mentioned, in the causes of HIV/AIDS, we see that there was little blood screening. They didn't have the necessary equipment to screen proper screening of the blood when you are going through blood transfusion. So there is no way to make sure whether the blood donated or blood given by a particular person is HIV free, or so. It's all led to the um, um, so spread of HIV/AIDS. So these are the institutional explanation for the lack of policy responses in the case of Myanmar, uh, vis-a-vis Thailand, where it could successfully uh, provide for the policy response to the spread of HIV/AIDS due to the democracy and the subsequent policies which it has given and gone through. Having said that, um, Burma has gone through a lot of change. There is no more junta regime, and it has successfully moving towards democracy. But there is still a struggle within the democratic regime in Burma. It's still upcoming regime. And the news article by Seth Maidans clearly emphasizes the challenges which are still ahead and how the new leader faces the issue and not responding to the minority are all contributing to the struggles within the society. So this basically provides the um, cultural and institutional explanation and the comparison between Burma and Thailand society, how in one society, particular institutions like democratic institutions are leading to positive policy responses, whereas in Burma, the historically junta regimes have failed to tackle the HIV spread uh, due to lack of policy responses. So, of course, Burma is changing, but still, we see in the news articles, it's still, military has certain key important controls, and the democratic leader is not responding to the minority issues. So it would be interesting to see what institutional explanation or institutions we can provide in future as the democracy is coming to play in Burma. So that is the cultural versus institutional explanation um, of comparative politics between here in this case we are comparing Thailand and Burma in tackling HIV/AIDS. So in the next video we will go into the democracy and I will talk about the article by Schmitter and Robert